As we mentioned at the top of our show, interest among both parties in this year's midterm elections is just sky high. And historically, increased enthusiasm means increased turnout. Take a look at 2010, when Republicans took control of the House. Enthusiasm just above 60% led to turnout just above 40%. In 2014, enthusiasm dropped, and so did turnout. But 2018, in former President Trump's second year in office, 65% of people said they were highly interested in the election, and turnout shot up to 50%, with over 100 million votes cast. This year, interest in the election is even higher at 70%, and it's likely turnout will follow, and we could see numbers that surpass the last midterm election. Those are the stakes. Joining me now is our panel, Stephanie Schriock, Senior Advisor for Strategic Victory Fund and former president of Emily's List, Rick Tyler, Republican strategist and an NBC political analyst, and Politico congressional reporter Nicholas Wu. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. So, Rick, let me start with you and these numbers. We're seeing high enthusiasm, as I just said. We're also seeing this urban-rural divide. And a lot of these numbers are a reminder of 2021, quite frankly, when you had Glenn Youngkin win the governorship in Virginia, Republicans with some big gains. So do you see it that way? And do Republicans run the risk of over-indexing, being too confident in these closing days?
Well, no one should be too confident because both parties are not very popular, even though Republicans are actually probably less popular, but both parties are seriously unpopular. I think this will be a huge turnout election because 7.5 million people have already voted. That's a phenomenon that came with COVID. I remember I was looking at a district in Maryland, actually Montgomery County, and of 100 people, and Biden won that county overwhelmingly, but only 6 of 100 people voted for Biden on Election Day. So that's just a massive not in-person voting, so it's a little hard to predict. But I think we will have a huge turnout. The problem is the country is equally divided on many issues. Biden's not popular. Trump and his candidates don't seem to be popular. The Democrat Party's not very popular. The Republican Party's not. So I think it's going to be these marginal issues where do independents go? Where do independent women go? These things, are there ticket splitters this time? Do we actually have people who will vote for the governor and then vote with the Republican Party and vote against the Republican in the Senate race? So
I'm glad you bring that up, ticket splitters. There's a real concern about that. And you talk about independent voters. Rick, Stephanie, we've seen some real swings among independent voters. President Biden in the danger zone with independents, and particularly when you look at independent women. They just a month ago favored Democrats more, and now it's shifted back over to Republicans.
Yeah, I think what you really got to look into at this juncture are the actual battleground races that we're in. If you look at these battleground Senate races in Pennsylvania, in Nevada, you were just talking to Congresswoman Lee, in Georgia, in Arizona, it looks very, very different. And a lot of times these Senate races, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is they kind of almost separate themselves out from anything national anyway, because there's so much money in these races and so much energy going on. And so I'm seeing that. I'm also seeing it in a lot of these battleground governors races, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, back to Nevada, where you've got the duplication of Senate and governors races. You got to really look at those states differently because there's so much more activity on the ground and on the air.
Yeah, and the action is going to be on the ground, certainly, in these closing days. Nicholas, let me ask you about something else that we are seeing in our poll. It shows that voters are not very worried about so-called morality issues. Not Democrats and not Republicans either. And look, that could potentially have an impact, particularly when you're talking about a critical race like the Senate race in Georgia, which could determine the balance of power. Obviously, Herschel Walker has faced a number of controversies. He's denied some of the allegations against him. But how does that impact a race like Georgia? What does that tell us about a race that is so close?
Well, Georgia is actually a very good test case for how much voters do care about a candidate's morals or broader concerns about their character. Herschel Walker is someone where there have been plenty of concerns raised about his truthfulness in storytelling, his record in the past and the like. But clearly, there are larger concerns here for voters heading into this election, whether it's inflation, whether it's abortion rights, and that appears to be the overriding factor, not individual candidate quality.
And one of the things that we're seeing, Republicans and Democrats both talking about the economy. But then you have Republicans, Rick, really focused on this issue of crime as a secondary issue. And I guess my question for you is, how energizing and motivating do you think an issue like crime is going to be, for example, in the Pennsylvania Senate race?
I think it depends where you live, and I think it depends on the perception that's generated crime. I think crime obviously it's a concern that people have because it affects them personally. But their personal health and safety is always a top issue, so crime is always up there. And the Democrats had the misstep of being associated with this idea of called defund the police, which was maniacally a stupid thing to talk about and to say. They tried to backtrack on that. Biden was actually very smart on this very quickly, going to New York, getting with the mayor there and talking about crime and saying, I'm not with the defund the police. But crime is a major issue, and people are very concerned about it. And when it comes to who handles crime, now the Republicans, of course, stepped in it too, calling the FBI the Gestapo, which I thought was a fairly maniacally stupid move also. But Republicans historically have done better on the crime issue when people perceive that crime is out of control.
Yeah. But the vast majority of Democrats were never of that position anyway.
No, but they were associated with it.
But they weren't. But the other piece of what's going on, of course, is the conversation still very active about access to abortion.
And I was going to ask you about
Hugely
that.
important.
Do you think some Democratic candidates have over-indexed, not that they shouldn't be talking about the issue of abortion, but at the risk of not talking enough about some of those other big issues like the economy?
Oh, I think when you get on the ground and you see what's being talked about, you're hearing economy, you're hearing jobs, you're hearing education. If you're a governor, a lot of conversation about education. And you're also hearing about abortion access. Like, we can actually talk about more than one issue at a time. And that goes for both sides and all candidates. And that's really the debates that are going on the ground.
Yeah, I wonder what you make of the generic ballot, which does show that Republicans seem to have the momentum right now. I mean, it's razor tight. But what do you make of that? And President Biden has said, look, he thinks there's going to be a shift back in the direction of Democrats. A lot of Democrats are skeptical about that. There's time. There is time. What do you think, Nicholas?
Well, look, even today, House Democrats are having to spend in the district of the campaign chair, Sean Patrick Maloney. They're making an ad buy there to protect him, where he was someone who they thought had been shored up, especially after we saw this surge of Democratic.
That's a stunner.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, what do you make of that?
I mean, he's still favored to win, but it would still be humiliating for Democrats if the campaign chair, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee chair, loses his seat. That's something that very rarely happens.
Yeah, Stephanie?
Well, welcome to redistricting cycle, where everything's a little up in the air and members of Congress have to reintroduce or introduce themselves to new parts of the district, and they got to make sure they do that. I was just in Kansas, actually, with Congresswoman Schriock Davids, who also, has a new chunk of her district, made it a little bit more red. I think they maybe overplayed their hand because she is doing great out there. And so I think we're going to see some surprise wins and some surprise losses across the board because things are so close and the enthusiasm is so high. I mean, just the fact that you saw 70, have you ever seen anything like that?
No.
We are going to see historic turnout. That's going to mean different things in different places. And I really do think we're going to have some surprises on both sides.
Rick, given what we're seeing, the enthusiasm amongst Republicans, what's the biggest potential pitfall at this point in time? Here you have President Biden saying, look, he thinks it's going to shift back to Democrats. What's the concern right now for Republicans that could actually make that happen?
I think the decision's mostly baked in. I mean, we're very close now. And people in the end, I have to believe that in the end, you take all the conventional analysis, which is it's an off-year election of a president who's not very popular, inflation's very high, housing costs are through the roof, mortgage rates are very high, and people are very concerned about it. In the end, people end up voting their self-interests, and that is the economy, and that's where your poll had showed that. I thought for a while that the Dobbs decision would be up there, but it was only at 9% in your latest poll, which people were concerned about it, and then they kind of refocused on staking gas prices,
I do want to talk about something that has been in the headlines as of late, both on the part of politicians and celebrities, which is anti-Semitism. We're seeing this come out of the mouths of both. And there has been a lot of criticism of it, a number of people speaking out. It's worth noting, when you look at the numbers, 12% of hate crimes were anti-Jewish over the past decade, a far larger percent than the percentage of Jews in America. Stephanie, how do we deal with this in our politics? And it doesn't seem like there's a price to pay for politicians who use anti-Semitic language.
I think we're going to see if that price is paid by Mastriano in Pennsylvania, which, of course, just Friday sort of stepped in it once again.
Yeah, Doug Mastriano, the gubernatorial candidate, made comments that were viewed as anti-Semitic. Former President Donald Trump tweeted something or posted something to his social media site that many viewed as anti-Semitic.
I mean, it's the toxicity that we continue to see, particularly from the mega Republican part of the Republican Party, where they want to divide and divide and divide, and this is part of it. Now, the problem is it is very, very dangerous. It puts people's lives in danger, and somehow we've got to calm it down. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I hope at some point the voters find, in themselves, even though they say it doesn't matter, I'm not so sure it doesn't matter something.
Rick, very quickly, the concern, this is becoming a dog whistle.
I think people ought to call it out. The history of the Jews is an extraordinary history that goes all the way back, pre-biblical history. Paul Johnson wrote an extraordinary book on the history of the Jews. They're amazing people with amazing culture. I'll be with the Jewish National Fund the weekend of the election, and it's just uncalled for, and people should call it out and not tolerate it.
I think that's a great final point. People should call it out and not tolerate it. Thank you. We could do an entire panel about that. It is a really critical topic.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.